Chapter 24. The Disciples' Arrival. Part 2. The sky trembled with the force of the disciples' descent. The ground beneath Brum'karoth quaked violently as the Empire's harbinger landed, his body tearing through the atmosphere like a comet. With a cataclysmic crash, his rocky form hit the city's outer defenses, sending a shockwave that shook the very foundation of the city. Buildings groaned and crumbled as the impact reverberated through the streets. Dust and debris swirled into the air, obscuring the figure of the disciple. But when the dust cleared, he stood there, towering, humanoid, with skin as hard as stone and veins of glowing magma beneath it. His eyes, cold and distant, scanned the city like a predator. The people of Brum'karoth had never witnessed such power. The disciple moved forward, each step causing the ground to crack and ripple like the surface of a boiling cauldron. He was a living force of destruction, and the city's defenses, mere mortal creations, seemed to melt before his might. From the moment he touched down, the disciple's presence was overwhelming. His body shifted and rippled as if the earth itself flowed through him, and he raised his hands, summoning great pillars of stone from the ground. Massive rock formations erupted, twisting in the air like serpents, then crashing down into the city. Streets were torn asunder, and entire sections of the outer walls were reduced to rubble in seconds. With a sharp motion of his arm, the disciple summoned a rock shield around himself, effortlessly deflecting the incoming arrows and bolts from the panicked militia. In the distance, militia commanders shouted commands, their voices barely audible over the chaos. The first wave of militia soldiers gathered to make a stand, their weapons drawn and ready. They charged at the disciple with fervor, but their efforts were futile. A group of crossbowmen fired at him, their bolts striking his rocky skin with a dull thud. The disciple barely flinched. With a wave of his hand, the ground cracked open beneath their feet. Boulders rose from the earth, creating barriers of stone and rubble, and the soldiers who tried to advance were crushed or sent tumbling by the sudden upheaval of the land. Those who managed to stand were faced with a barrage of jagged rocks, hurled through the air with unyielding force. Amidst the destruction, the disciple spoke, his voice low, rumbling like distant thunder. "Bring me the weapon against the Empire." His words were clear, but their meaning was cryptic, and they reverberated through the wreckage of the city. The disciple did not specify what the weapon was, but his demand hung heavily in the air. His eyes, glowing with molten fire, scanned the city as though searching for something, or someone. The city's defenders, helpless against his onslaught, could only watch in panic. The once proud walls of Brum'karoth were no match for the disciples' power, and the militia commanders quickly realized they needed a different strategy. Their normal weaponry was useless. "Retreat to the armory," one of the commanders shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. "Get the modern weapons. We can't fight him like this." In the face of this overwhelming force, the militia's leaders ordered the retreat, rallying their forces toward the city's armory. The disciple, undeterred by their movements, continued his rampage, unleashing wave after wave of destruction. His earth magic flowed through him effortlessly, shaping the very city into a weapon against its defenders. As the disciple wreaked havoc, the citizens of Brum'karoth cowered in fear, and the cultists of the Sent Ones, led by Torgar, were forced to reassess their priorities. The war between the factions seemed insignificant in comparison to the threat now looming over the city. Yet the disciples' cryptic words had not gone unnoticed. The cultists whispered among themselves, some wondering if the weapon the disciple demanded was something they had long feared. Meanwhile, the disciple's destruction showed no sign of abating. His massive form was like a living storm, and the cries of Brum'karoth's people could be heard throughout the city, as he continued to crush anything in his path. The militia's retreat to the armory was the only hope left. With modern weapons in hand, they might have a chance to fight back. But for now, the disciple had established his dominance over Brum'karoth, and the city was left to wonder how it could possibly survive this new, terrifying threat. The disciple loomed above the ruins of Brum'karoth, his towering form casting a long shadow over the panicked city. The earth trembled beneath his feet with every step, and his rocky skin glistened in the dim, dust-choked light. His voice, now a chilling growl, reverberated through the streets as he addressed the city for the second time. "Bring me the weapon against the Empire," the disciple demanded, his words echoing through the broken city like a death knell. "I know it is hidden nearby, in the secret temple of your ancestors, that stinking city of dwarves. There are relics there. I will find them and use them to crush all who dare oppose the Empire." His words were cryptic, yet there was no mistaking the urgency in his voice. Brum'karoth had already been reduced to rubble by his earth-shattering powers, yet he stood undeterred, demanding a weapon none of the city's defenders even fully understood. The militia, having retreated to their last line of defense near the city's remaining stronghold, were scrambling. With their conventional weapons now rendered useless against the disciples' onslaught, they had no choice but to seek the only solution they could think of: modern weapons stored in the city's armory. "Armory, now!" the commander barked as soldiers rushed toward the fortified weapon caches in a desperate attempt to arm themselves with more advanced tools. They knew the disciple would never be deterred by their crude methods, but the hope of any kind of weapon that could harm him clung to their tired minds. Torgar, standing amidst his cultists in a nearby sanctuary, watched the chaos unfold. His brow furrowed in thought, his hands clenched tightly around his staff. While many of the Sent Ones had already taken up arms, some of them hesitated. They questioned the disciples' demands. Was the weapon truly a relic of ancient power, or was it some trap? Torgar's own mind was clouded with doubt. He had heard of the weapon, but had always believed it to be a mere myth, a story passed down through generations. Yet, the disciples' certainty cast a new light on the situation, and the thought of a weapon capable of challenging the Empire stirred something deep within him. He could no longer ignore it. "Bring me the weapon," the disciple repeated, his voice rising with each word, rumbling like a distant earthquake. "Do not test me further. I will level this city to the ground if necessary. It will fall, and the weapon will be mine." His presence in the city was now absolute. No longer were the streets merely occupied by his destructive force. He had come to claim something. What it was, no one knew. But the urgency of his demands set the entire city on edge. Even the cultists of the Sent Ones were conflicted, unsure of whether to answer the disciples' call for the weapon, or to remain focused on their own survival in the wake of his devastating attack. A few of the more daring cultists began to whisper of the temple's location, near the city, hidden in the wilderness. But the disciple had already hinted at its whereabouts, describing it as a place of forgotten power. It seemed his knowledge surpassed theirs, and that realization made everyone uneasy. Amidst the growing chaos, a decision was made. Brum'karoth's remaining forces would make one final attempt to resist. The militia, now armed with more advanced weaponry, prepared for their confrontation. But as the disciple continued his rampage, their weapons seemed like nothing more than toys in the face of his vast powers. Torgar stood silently, knowing that something would have to change. The cultists had to make a choice, either align with the disciple and seek the weapon, or face the growing peril of the Empire's might. But the disciple's cryptic message continued to haunt him: the weapon against the Empire. What exactly did he mean? As Brum'karoth's defenders braced for what was to come, the disciples' demand echoed once more in the air, growing louder and more insistent. The city's fate seemed sealed, and all the factions within Brum'karoth would be forced to confront not only the disciples' power, but the looming question of the weapon that might turn the tide of this cataclysmic battle. The ground trembled beneath the weight of the disciple's arrival, his enormous form causing the earth to crack and shift as he advanced relentlessly through Brum'karoth. His power over earth magic was almost overwhelming, tearing through buildings and military barricades like paper. The city's outer defenses had been obliterated, and now his path seemed clear, straight toward the cult of the Sent One's headquarters. At first, the disciples' presence had been a faint, distant awareness, like a storm on the horizon. But as he drew closer, something began to stir in the air around Lucas and Mina. They felt it first, the subtle shift in the magic that surrounded them. It was as if the very ground beneath their feet resonated with the disciples' approach. His power, vast and unyielding, was drawing nearer. He can feel us, Mina thought, a chill running down her spine. She had known this moment would come, but the reality of it was even more harrowing than she had imagined. Her hands gripped her weapon tightly, a mix of dread and determination flooding her veins. "The disciple is headed this way," Lucas said, his voice steady but laced with a quiet tension. "We can't just wait for him to reach the HQ." Thomas, already in motion, nodded firmly. "No. We have to act before he tears everything apart. The militia's holding him off, but it won't last long." His eyes scanned the chaos unfolding outside the walls of the headquarters. The battle in the streets was already catastrophic, but the disciple was still marching forward. From his position, the disciple could sense the powerful energy of Lucas and Mina, the unspoken connection between them stirring something deep within him. He didn't fully understand what he felt, but it was undeniable. Someone was close. And that power, unlike any the disciple had encountered before, was drawing him in. The earth beneath him groaned as he drew closer to the HQ. His colossal footfalls shook the foundations of the buildings, and the ground split wide open in a line straight toward the heart of the city. The disciple didn't even slow down. He knew his purpose. He would eradicate the source of resistance and find the weapon hidden against the Empire. The attack on the headquarters came without warning. One moment, the cultists and militia were regrouping, trying to coordinate defenses. The next, the disciples' hands slammed into the outer wall of the HQ with a deafening crack, sending debris flying in all directions. Cultists and militia alike were thrown to the ground as the massive force shattered the stone, exposing the inner sanctum to his fury. Inside the walls, chaos erupted as Torgar barked orders, rallying the cultists to defend their home. But no one had ever seen a force like this before. The militia, now armed with modern weapons, tried to retaliate, but their efforts were futile. Bullets ricocheted off the disciple's rocky skin, causing no more than minor dents in his impervious form. Explosives, launched from the city's vaults, crumbled against the ground around him, only adding to the growing destruction. With a snarl, the disciple raised a massive hand, and the earth around him responded, forming towering rock spires that he hurled with precision toward the defenders. A group of militia soldiers were crushed beneath the weight of the boulders, their weapons and bodies splintering upon impact. The cultists fought back desperately, but the disciple's power was too much. He carved through them with ease, his control over the earth turning it into a weapon more destructive than any blade. Lucas and Mina stood at the ready, eyes fixed on the growing chaos outside. The ground beneath their feet shook, and the sound of the battle roared like thunder in their ears. They had made their decision. They wouldn't wait for the enemy to tear apart the city or the HQ. "We need to stop him," Mina said, her voice low but firm. "Now." "Yes," Lucas replied, gripping his weapon tightly. "Let's end this." Thomas stepped forward, his sword drawn. No more running. No more hiding. Together, the three of them moved toward the breach in the wall, the force of the disciples' attack already starting to make its way through the interior. A group of cultists rushed toward them, but the trio barreled past them, focused entirely on the massive being advancing toward them. As they moved, the sound of footsteps from the city's militia was growing louder. Some were armed with modern rifles, technology that, while not overwhelmingly powerful, was still a step up from the standard weaponry. The soldiers were attempting to organize a defensive line, but the disciples' assault was far too overwhelming for conventional weapons. "Fall back to the weaponry," a commander yelled, rallying his forces. "Get the modern arms now." It was a last-ditch effort to use the more advanced weaponry to push back the disciple, but everyone knew the odds were slim. The disciple was closing in on the inner sanctum, his senses locked onto Lucas and Mina's presence. His eyes narrowed as he picked up on their energy. He knew he could not let them escape again. They were the key, whether they understood it or not. With a deafening roar, the disciple surged forward, tearing through what little resistance was left. The air itself seemed to crackle with the force of his arrival. Lucas, Mina, and Thomas faced him head-on, their resolve unwavering. They knew the stakes. "This ends now," Thomas muttered. Together, they braced for the fight ahead. The disciple's destruction was far from over. His assault on the headquarters was just the beginning. But Lucas, Mina, and Thomas had made their stand. There would be no retreat this time. The disciple would not leave until they were finished.